Hello and welcome to Economic Forum. My name is Tawanda Gutlanga. This week we are focusing on the role of the CEO in turbulent times and as well their ability to read such times. In the studio we have invited from the CEO Africa Roundtable, Mr. KIPSON Gundani. He is an economist and the executive director there. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Tawanda. It's a pleasure to be here.
2020 could not have been the best test for any chief executive officer. From a CEO Africa Roundtable perspective, how has it been?
Indeed, 2020 has been a very tough year, particularly for business leaders, due to the corona pandemic, which disturbed the ordinary terrain of doing business globally. CEOs found themselves in a deep end where they had to make some drastic decisions in order to make their companies afloat. Some of the decisions are required to downsize, and downsizing requires maybe retrenching people. Some requires remodeling and re-engineering their business models, which might mean changing totally the course of doing things within the entity. We have been hardened as Zimbabweans because apart from the corona-induced difficulties, we had residual and historical difficulties owing to our unstable macroeconomic environment, owing to our weak economy. So we had CEOs that were probably geared up to fight such kind of shocks as they may be. So I think in Zimbabwe, that's why even if you look at the job losses and the effects in Zimbabwe, compared to our regional peers like South Africa, for example, the impact has been less in Zimbabwe. And that is largely owes to the kind of leadership that we have both in the public and private sector, which was kind of prompt in terms of response to this corona pandemic.
It's very interesting that you do say that because Zimbabwe has always faced the brand as a benchmark for failure. And yet you're saying we have hardened CEOs. Maybe just out of interest, the type of CEO that we have in Zimbabwe and the sort of work that is cut out for them compared to other jurisdictions.
The Zimbabwean environment is not a straitjacket. You cannot go pick a CEO from Abuja, throw him in Zimbabwe and expect that guy to flourish because it's a different terrain altogether. Like I said before, you've got a character of CEOs that is used in dealing with everyday difficulties because this country is never short of shocks. I don't agree to the notion that we are a benchmark of failure. Yes, we have not done well as a country in many spheres, but we have also done exceptionally well in many spheres. So we are a country that has got unique competencies, and one of those unique competencies is the human capital base, which is very vigilant, which is well thought of, which can read the global terrain very well. That's why you can still find Zimbabweans who go into foreign territories and be able to conquer and make money and actually lead big corporates there. When you talk about Standard Bank in South Africa, you've got many Zimbabweans there. You can talk literally of many corporates around the globe. You find a Zimbabwean mark, a Zimbabwean face around there. Even in Google, there are Zimbabweans there.
Very interesting that you highlight that, given, of course, the corona-induced terrain, although Zimbabwe already had some shocks embedded in them and they have had quite an impact. But what has been the biggest milestone when we look at performance of business leaders in Zimbabwe?
I think there was a very big realization out of this, a realization that companies and individuals do not exist in isolation. We've got an example of an initiative called Business Fighting COVID Trust, which raised significant resources, which went in supporting our healthcare centers and even our frontline workers in the healthcare fraternity so that we fight the corona pandemic. The St. Anne's Hospital was actually revamped by private people who just come together and sell a need. So the greatest takeaway from this pandemic was a realization that as businesses, we don't exist for the sake of our businesses only, but we exist for the broader society. So at this juncture, we did find a group of companies and people coming together for a common cause. So that actually taught us a big lesson to always prioritize where your mouths are. to always put your money where it matters most. And where it matters most is to invest domestically.
Now let's look at Zimbabwe and the relationship that it has with other jurisdictions, South Africa being the biggest trading partner, China, for example, and looking at the way that we rely on South Africa and China. How has it been in terms of business on the part of Zimbabwe?
Of course, there was a very huge disruption on trade, which obviously compromised the coming in of raw materials, because we largely depend on imported raw materials as a country, a scenario which should not be if everything was going to be okay. Also, we did witness some general decline in level of economic activities ultimately, with the estimation of 4.1% negative growth according to the Ministry of Finance. But if you look at the World Bank and IMF estimates, actually they estimated that this economy contracted by over 10%. What it signals is that there was a disruption of normal economic flow in the country, which ultimately lead to general decline in growth of the economy. And what it means we have become poorer, you and me, as the residents of this country. Ultimately, that's what it is. But that was 2020. We know what was the elephant in the room.
Join us after the break as we seek to understand if business leaders are united after all. Join us there. Welcome back. We are looking at the role of the CEO in turbulent times, given, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, among other macroeconomic factors. And in the studio, we have Mr. KIPSON GUNDANI. Now, let's talk about business leaders and business linkages. Have we taken advantage of the need to have linkages in order for us to be fighting against any shock that can come our way?
Indeed, yes, Tawanda, but what you need to appreciate is the transforming demographic profile of the Zimbabwean industry. We have got like a pyramid kind of structure of our private sector, where the majority of functioning enterprises in this country are medium to small enterprises, let alone most of them informal, meaning to say they are not registered, they operate under a tree, and it's very difficult to deal with those kind of things. But then you also begin to appreciate that there is a growing medium sector, which is technically now driving this economy. If you look at these whole surrounding areas, Milton Park, Eastleigh, they are all offices. It's no longer residential areas. And that signifies a very fact that there is a growing medium-sized entity. And that is the entity which requires to be linked up with our traditional big corporates, which have got the deep pockets and the expenditure power to be able to stimulate the upcoming businesses. In the
same vein, they also distance themselves and call themselves the big boys club, excluding these that are actually growing.
This is business. It's as long as there is margin, as long as there is an element of making profits along, then the linkages make sense. What is refreshing is to know that within the current National Development Strategy 1, there is a value chain approach to industrial development. And what a value chain approach to industrial development entails is that it has to be a system of linkages. You link one sector to another sector to another sector. However, as a company, it takes you to have the fortitude to be able to participate in that linkage. No one is going to come to your premise and say, hey, I want you to buy this or to supply this to me. You have to make the initial step so that you are rightly positioned. So you have actually to start the policy matrix and framework and the direction in which this economy is heading. You position yourself correctly. You need to have a robust positional strategy as an entity. Then you begin to participate in this linkage.
But are these strategies, obviously they start from somewhere, institutions, business membership organizations, for example, are they clear themselves in terms of strategy, or it's now a question of just shooting in the dark and handling with issues from a daily perspective?
Indeed, yes. There are a lot of value chains that have been developed with the full participation of business associations, and the business associations actually are the best platform to unleash this information to the industrialists. For example, if you talk about the cotton to clothing strategy, it's a clear strategy, and the players in the agri and agro-processing industry are actively involved in that. If you talk about the leader strategy, actually it's also one of the robust strategies that we do have. So I think these strategies are well defined, and the BMOs are better positioned to propagate actually utilization and participation of their member companies into this initiative.
There's always been a drive that comes from organizations such as CEO Africa Roundtable, where they are about lobbying, and they always spur government to take the leading role. Is that the way that it really should be, or now it's time that we do find business leaders also taking their role in ensuring that the economy comes to a resurgence?
You know what, it is very clear the role of government should be to create an environment where you and me can partake a particular economic activity and be able to make money. Full stop. That is the role of the government. The role of the government is never to do business. It is not the business of government. It is the business of private citizens and private investors, which is the private sector you are talking about. That is clear, that is not negotiable. But let's also not be oblivious of the very important facts. To say, for the past years, Zimbabwean environment has been very toxic to any business entity. We have witnessed a number of companies closing because it was just difficult.
In what way has it been toxic?
Right. One thing that you need to be aware of, any business would want to operate in a low-cost business environment. So you discover that one of the biggest bottleneck in this country has been a regulatory cost on doing business. So many regulations that you have to comply with. And those regulations, it takes money to be able to comply. That has been the biggest cost. The second biggest cost has been the absence of basic enablers and amenities. And I cannot produce my own power. Okay, it is the role of the state-owned enterprises to provide power affordably to me. We have had a serious blackouts in the history of this country, and that is also edified on the cost of doing business in the country. If you look at the road network and transportation system, with the defunct of our rail system here, it means most companies have to rely on road transport, using many lorries or going it, and that also edifies with the cost of doing. So the environment has been costly, owing from a poor regulatory environment,
despite
which do not support productive investment.
But government has made calls for investment in those.
It is not
sectors.
sufficient. It is not sufficient.
What is stopping investors from coming in?
Anyone can go on top of a mountain and say, "Come and invest." Capital is timid. It flows downstream. It flows where it can generate more, and where it can be protected, where it feels safe. So you can make whatever call that you're going to make, but what investors look at, they look at the safety of the investment and the potential for that investment to get pregnant.
But recently, Zimbabwe has gotten international recognition for being one of the safest and the most consistent countries when it comes to the policy framework of doing business.
Agreeably. That's why we are now making inroads and strides, and we give kudos to the TSP. I think it has been instrumental in stabilizing the environment and putting this country back on a consistent policy path. I think that is commendable, and that's why personally I would call that we support the National Development Strategy 1 now ever than before, because clearly you can see some macroeconomic prudence that is being followed. You can clearly see a direction that is being followed from stability to growth, and to be able to be consistent and be sustainable in that regard.
Is the private sector made up of characters who are crybabies? Let's talk about it in the third and final segment. Welcome back. We have Mr. KIPSON Gundani from the CEO Africa Roundtable as we're discussing the role of the CEO today in the shock or the VUCA environment that is prevailing due to COVID-19 and other macroeconomic factors. Now, KIPSON, before you went to the break, you did highlight that the Transitional Stabilization Program was highly successful. And now NDS is coming in, which is being used as a benchmark for accelerated economic growth. But when we look at infrastructure, like you highlighted, we still have a gap. There has been some budgetary allocation to that effect. How, in your view, is that enough to deal with the gaps?
Evidently, it's not enough given the infrastructure gap that we have in this country. We should come to a point where we need to realize that the infrastructure development is not exclusively a government role alone. We need to come to a point where we begin to attract private capital into development of public infrastructure through PPP arrangements, either on a build, operate, transfer arrangement or whatever arrangement that can be made. I think that is key in order to accelerate the infrastructure development in this country, so that at least we also try to make it easier to do business in Zimbabwe. So to answer you in short, it is not enough, and I implore the government to begin to seriously look into private capital to develop infrastructure in this country.
But let's talk about the private sector itself. There has been a lot of accusation in the public sector, corruption and the like. But corporate governance issues are also affecting the private sector. To what extent are organizations such as yours in dealing with the vice of corruption and corporate governance?
Yes, it is a fact that corruption is really endemic in our society, be it public or private sector. What we do as CEO Africa Roundtable predominantly is to use what we call moral suasion, which is actually to preach the gospel of the right business ethics, doing things right. However, I think there is no clear, robust, watertight legal framework in this country that enforces good corporate governance. Everything is just been moral suasion. With the coming in of ZAC and its strengthening, we hope that will also accelerate the efforts to deal with the corruption endemic. But it is indeed true that corruption has become cancerous and it's become an epitome of costs in doing business in this country.
But obviously it would be, someone would actually laugh at it when you say it's cancerous, it's endemic, and at the same time we use moral suasion. It's like giving corruption, kind of a slap in the face without really
indeed,
effect.
I'm talking from what we do. We are not a statutory body. We cannot sue anybody. Okay, there should be a legal framework that empowers authorities that be to be able to deal with that. What we can do is probably maybe to whistleblow, do that. But that is not sufficient. If you look at countries that have dealt with corruption decisively and conclusively, Singapore, for example, they've been very ruthless when it comes to this. And the only creature that can be ruthless on corruption is government. They have to lead the role. China went all the way to firing people, shooting people who are corrupt. Singapore almost went the same route, and they'll be able to. The best way to deal with corruption is not to deal with the small fish. It's actually to deal with the big fish, so that you send a lasting example. And the only entity that can do that is the authorities with the government, because they've got the power and the authority to do so.
2020 has had mixed fortunes. The world over, we've seen CEOs rising, others falling. Now the second richest man is the CEO of Tesla. In the COVID pandemic itself, when we cast our eye to 2021, what are some of the, what does it look like?
We expect 2021 to be a better year by virtue of the fact that we've become used to this corona pandemic. As ruthless as it may be, most companies have now devised strategies to work around it. So it ceases to be a shock anymore, but it becomes a factor that is inherent, which you need to operate alongside and be able to manage. So 2021 inevitably will be a better year. But there's one writer who once said, only the paranoid survive. It takes the CEO and the business leaders to be able to read the terrain and model their businesses so that they tailor-make, they adapt to the current situation. Otherwise, we're still going to witness more casualties when it comes to corporates, and we are also going to witness more companies, those that are going to adapt to doing very, very well. So 2021, I suspect it will be a better year, but it will not be all roses. You still need to play your game as a CEO, as business leaders, so that you are able to operate competitively in such kind of environment.
Moving into 2021, I know recently at the breakfast meeting, which was a hybrid, both virtual and actual physical, but which is the best way to go, especially for Zimbabwe?
Well, Zimbabweans, this is my own reading. Zimbabweans, I'm sorry to say this, but most of our business leaders, they are not used to the virtual way of doing things. They still need the touch, the physical interaction. But you cannot continue to ignore digital migration. It is the fourth industrial revolution. It is there. There's nothing that you can do about it. What you need to do is to embrace it and be able to use it competitively and productively. So I think we are going to see a gradual migration into a virtual way of doing things, but we still have predominantly a greater demand in the physical interaction of doing business. That's the order of the future, and it shall be so for many, many years to come.
And of course, your prediction in terms of the performance of the economy. Now we have NDS1, which is leading the vision of government. Is that really going to be taken up by the private sector?
The NDS1 targets 5% growth for the next 5 years. Well, your guess is as good as mine, but my only worry is on the assumptions that are underpinning that growth. One of the assumptions is obviously fiscal discipline and monetary control discipline. Given our historical experiences, that has always been an unmet target. So I doubt if that is going to be met. Also, if you look at the anchors of that growth, one of it is mining, where they're targeting the 12 billion mining sector by the year 2030. But you also find that mining investments have got a longer gestation period. So I'm not sure whether this estimated growth and the investments are going to marry within the lifespan of the NDS1. Also, when you look at agriculture, it's one of the sectors with great potential, but it's a sector that is hugely underfunded. And your guess is good as mine as well. So the assumptions is only the tricky part surrounding the growth, but others, the potential is there. So we wish this country good luck. We play a part and you're going to play yours as well.
KIPSON Gundani, thank you so much for finding time to come to the studio.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Our guest was Mr. KIPSON Gundani, an economist and executive director at the Africa CEO Roundtable, as we were focusing on the role of the CEO in turbulent times. We've come to the end of the program. Do join us again next time as we continue to bring you interesting topics on Economic Forum. My name is Tawana Gudlanga. It's pleasant viewing.